I don't pay wages so some disease-carrying, stinking man can walk around the lobby of my billion-dollar corporation. Roll up your sleeve! Did you hear me? I heard you, and I'm telling you there's no rule that requires that. I make the rules. You're an hourly cleaning guy. What right do you have to talk to me about rules? Disgusting. Pack your things and get the hell out of here, right now!
At the same time, the 15-year-old daughter walking beside the city's most powerful female CEO suddenly stopped dead in her tracks.
He's the one who saved me.
And that afternoon, that arrogant manager was about to realize he had just signed the death warrant for his own career when he dared to trample on the man who had saved this entire empire. At 5:47 in the morning, the small kitchen in Kensington began to tremble with the sound of an old coffee maker. It didn't brew fast, and it didn't brew well, but Marcus Webb had kept it for 6 years, ever since he found it at a thrift store for $12. Every morning, the machine rattled and spat out thin black coffee, slightly burnt, hot enough to wake him before the city remembered there were people who had to get up before the light. His one-bedroom apartment sat on the second floor of a tired brick row building. On the refrigerator were a rent payment calendar, the electric bill, and a reminder slip for Zoe's after-school fees. There was also a drawing Zoe had made of the two of them standing under the sun. He poured coffee into a chipped enamel mug, then opened a drawer and took out a small zip bag. Zoe's lunch was simple: a peanut butter sandwich cut diagonally 4 slices, a pack of discount crackers, and a folded napkin. He placed everything into a purple plastic lunchbox and checked the lid twice. His own lunch had only cold rice, a boiled egg, and the leftover apple pieces that had been cut less neatly. On the table, Marcus's wallet lay open beside his keys. He counted the money again, even though he already knew the number. $23 until Friday. $23 for gas, milk, scar ointment, and any problem that came before payday. He folded the 3 bills and pushed them deep into the inner pocket, as if hiding them better could make them last longer. The door to Zoe's bedroom was cracked open. The 7-year-old girl lay on her side, one cheek pressed into the pillow, her curls slipping loose from the cheap silk scarf Marcus had tied for her the night before. Her alarm still had 5 minutes before it rang. Marcus stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, but didn't step in. He wanted to pull the blanket up over her shoulder, but if he woke Zoe early, she would ask why his eyes were red. On Marcus's right arm, under the dark blue long sleeve, the scar ran from near his wrist almost to his elbow. It was a crooked half moon, the old skin glossy and tighter than the skin around it. Every night, Zoe insisted on rubbing ointment onto it with her small finger, serious as a nurse. Every morning, Marcus pulled his sleeve down low, not because he was ashamed, he told himself. It was just that some questions made old wounds hurt in a different way. He left home at 6:18. Outside, Kensington still smelled damp from the night, and a bus passed, leaving behind a thin trail of exhaust. Marcus zipped his jacket and walked quickly toward the stop, his broad back turned to the storefronts that were still closed. He used to wear a different uniform, the kind that made children look at him with bright eyes. Now he wore a dark blue janitor's shirt, black pants, and slip-resistant shoes with worn heels. He didn't complain. Any job that paid on time deserved to be done right. At 7:15, Marcus started his shift in the main lobby of Kincaid Group. The building stood 42 floors high, its glass front rising like a declaration that money could wash away every trace of dirt. The grand lobby had white marble floors, a black stone reception desk, and fresh flowers replaced every 2 days. It didn't smell like anywhere in Kensington. It smelled like expensive perfume and clean air conditioning. Marcus pushed the floor scrubber out of the supply room. He checked the wheels, the cord, the water level in the tank, then started near the revolving door. He cleaned in straight lines, slow and steady. An old earbud sat in one ear, the volume low enough for old soul music to mix with the sound of heels and elevator doors. Office workers passed him the way they passed a piece of furniture. Some lifted their feet when the machine came close. Some didn't change direction, so Marcus had to stop. Invisibility was usually more polite than that. He was used to people noticing the smallest flaw in his work, but not the stretches of floor he cleaned twice, so guests wouldn't slip. In buildings like this, cleanliness was only noticed when it disappeared. The person keeping it there was usually treated like a shadow paid by the hour. Marcus didn't resent that every minute. He stored it away, the same way he stored change, bills, and answers Zoe was still too young to hear. Then he kept working because the floor still had to be cleaned before 8 every morning. Linda Torres was the first person to see him every morning. She was 52, worked in administration on the 17th floor, had reddish-brown dyed hair, and always carried a thermos of tea. When she passed, she nodded to Marcus. Just one nod, but enough to say she knew the man cleaning the floor had a name. Marcus answered with a slight tilt of his head. Sometimes that was enough to make a morning feel less cold. In the far corner of the lobby, on the cream leather sofa reserved for VIP guests, Amara Kincaid sat waiting for her mother. She was 15, wearing a private school uniform with a dark blue blazer. On her lap was a cloth-bound notebook. While her mother's assistant paced back and forth on the phone, Amara leaned down and drew a half-moon shape in the corner of the page. The pen strokes repeated until the curved mark became dark. She had been drawing that shape since she was very young, before she even understood that memory could keep people alive. In every notebook, that half-moon always came back. Marcus didn't know who the girl on the sofa was. He only knew that area had to stay dry because executive floor guests usually didn't look down at their feet. He guided the scrubber around the lobby rug and cleaned the section near the entrance again, where last night's rain had left faint wet marks from shoe soles. Derek Holt appeared at 7:42. He was the facilities manager responsible for everything in the building from light bulbs to cleaning contracts, and he liked the way that title made people call him by his last name. Derek was walking with 4 potential tenants, all of them in light-colored suits. He smiled like a man selling perfection. Spotless lobby, private elevators, 24/7 security, 5-star standards. When the group walked near the scrubber, one woman almost placed her heel on a small wet streak. No one slipped, no one got dirty. But Derek saw it. His smile tightened. He kept leading the group toward the elevator, pressed the button for the 32nd floor, and waited until the doors closed. Then he turned back. Marcus had seen that walk many times in his 8 months here. Derek never scolded people in front of anyone he needed to impress. He waited for the useful audience to leave, then found another audience. Receptionists, passing employees, people low enough to witness it. He stopped in front of the scrubber and looked down at the little wet mark, as if it were a moral failure. Marcus turned off the machine, took out his earbud, and stood straight. He was taller than Derek, but the way he held his hands in front of himself made him seem like he wasn't taking up space. Derek began with procedure. He talked about surface standards, tenant safety, professionalism in a Class A environment. His voice wasn't loud. It was measured so outsiders could mistake it for feedback. Marcus apologized briefly and said he would clean it again right away. He bent down to take a dry towel from the cart. If things had ended there, Marcus's morning would only carried one more small exhaustion. But Derek didn't want to fix the mistake. He wanted someone to bend low enough to prove he had power. His eyes stopped on Marcus's long sleeve. According to policy, employees had to wear gloves when handling strong chemicals. That morning, Marcus had only been cleaning water. Derek asked anyway. Then he ordered Marcus to roll up his sleeve to check whether he was following protective gear rules. Marcus went quiet for one beat. His right hand closed very slightly. He said the gloves were on the cart, and if Derek needed to inspect them, he could look right there. Derek didn't look at the gloves, he looked at the sleeve. The lobby kept running around them. The revolving door opened. Employees tapped their badges. Linda Torres had just reached the reception desk to sign for some documents when she stopped. She saw Marcus keeping his voice calm. She saw Derek standing too close. She looked down at the papers in her hand, then looked back. Derek repeated the order, clearer this time. He said this was a professional environment, and he needed to see the employee's arm. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He only said no, politely enough to make the word hurt more. There are boundaries poor people still try to keep, even when no one believes they have the right to any. Derek's face reddened slightly, not from shame, but because he had been refused in the glass lobby of his building. He stepped forward and grabbed Marcus's right sleeve. Marcus moved half a step back, but not quickly enough. Derek yanked hard. The old janitor's shirt tore along the seam, the sound dry and sharp across the lobby. The pulled fabric scraped over the scarred skin, opening a thin line of blood on skin that fire had once changed forever. In that moment, the kid group lobby finally saw Marcus, not because he had cleaned hundreds of yards of marble, not because he had shown up on time for 8 months, but because his sleeve had been torn open like a curtain ripped away. The half-moon scar showed on his right arm. It wasn't beautiful the way people like to talk about heroic scars. It was raised, uneven in color, stretching from the wrist toward the elbow like the mark of something hot that had once clung to the skin. Blood seeped at the scar's edge, very little, but clear red against his dark skin under the lobby's white lights. Marcus looked down at his arm. His face didn't change much. Only his jaw tightened, and his shoulders went stiff. He pulled the sleeve down by reflex, but the fabric was torn. It couldn't cover him anymore. Behind the sofa, Mara looked up at the sound of fabric ripping. The pen in her hand stopped in the middle of a curve. Then her eyes slid down to the man's right arm, to the half-moon shape on his skin. Her whole body went still. The notebook on her lap was open to a fresh page. In the corner, the half-moon she had drawn that morning sat there, almost the same curve, the same break at one end, the same feeling of something that had once burned through. Amara looked at the page, then at Marcus's arm. 10 years of blurred memory, siren smoke, an arm shielding her face, the smell of burning fabric, and a man's voice telling her to stay low. All of it slammed into her. She jumped to her feet. The notebook fell from her lap onto the sofa. No one noticed. Eric was talking about policy violations. He mentioned lack of cooperation and an HR report. Marcus still stood there, his arm bleeding, his eyes down on the floor as if the piece of marble in front of him deserved saving more than he did. Linda Torres took one step forward, then stopped. She saw the blood, saw the scar, saw Amara standing frozen behind the sofa. But Derek turned his head toward the people gathering, and Linda lowered her face. Her silence had weight. The executive elevator opened. Victoria Kincaid stepped into the lobby with 2 assistants, her phone pressed to her ear, her black coat perfectly tailored, her face cold and alert. Kincaid Group, worth $2.3 billion, carried her name, but it also carried the name of the husband who had died in a fire 10 years earlier. That morning she was listening to a report about a major lease deal and a facility staffing issue. She hadn't looked up yet. She only told her assistant to let HR handle the termination decision before the end of the day. That sentence dropped into the lobby just as Amara stepped away from the sofa. The 3 lines of sight hadn't met yet. Marcus was looking at his torn sleeve and exposed arm. Derek was looking at Victoria like power had arrived right on time to legitimize him. Victoria was looking at her phone, not yet seeing the blood, not yet seeing her daughter, not yet seeing the man with the scar her family had searched for in the dark for a decade. And Amara was looking at the half-moon on Marcus's arm with an expression no one in the lobby understood. Only the audience knew that in what looked like a janitor being humiliated over a water streak, the past from 10 years earlier had opened its eyes inside the city's brightest building. 10 years earlier, North Philly at 11:47 at night didn't look like the kind of place where a hero story was waiting to be born. The streets were wet after a light rain, traffic lights blinked over intersections that were almost empty, and late fall wind moved through storefronts already pulled shut behind metal gates. Marcus Webb was 28 then, wearing a faded jacket and work shoes dusted with flour and sugar water from his side shift at the corner grocery. He had just locked the back stockroom, received $46 in cash inside a paper envelope, and started walking home because he wanted to save bus fare. His phone had 9% battery left. In his jacket pocket was a District 9 volunteer card, a thin card with worn edges that he still kept straight like a promise. Marcus wasn't a professional firefighter yet. He was training, waiting to complete enough hours, saving every small payment to finish his certification. During the day, he picked up security work. At night, he worked extra shifts at the grocery. On weekends, he volunteered at the station. The fire appeared before the sirens did. Marcus saw orange light thrown against the brick wall of a 6-story apartment building on Lehigh Avenue, then saw smoke pouring out of the 3rd-floor windows. At first, he stopped on the sidewalk like everyone else. Someone was screaming across the street. A woman in a bathrobe ran down the outside stairs barefoot. Pointing up, Marcus called 911, speaking fast and clear, repeating the address twice. The dispatcher told him trucks were on the way. He knew trucks were on the way. But the 3rd floor was burning right in front of him, and every second of waiting could be the second when somebody stopped breathing. He ran to the front entrance. Smoke had already pushed down the stairwell, black and low, smelling of burning plastic mixed with wet wood, wires, and old paint. Then he heard a child, not clearly, not like crying in a movie. It was a small broken sound trapped in the smoke coming from upstairs. Marcus stood at the bottom of the stairs for exactly 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds were real. He was afraid. He thought about the fact that he had no air tank, no protective gear, no crew behind him. Then the child's voice came again, weaker this time. The 3 seconds ended. Marcus took off his jacket, soaked it in a dirty bucket of water by the door, wrung it over his face and mouth, and bent low. One hand followed the railing. His feet counted the steps. 1st floor, 2nd floor. The smoke made his eyes burn so badly that tears came right away, but he didn't wipe them. He used what he remembered from training. Don't stand up straight, don't touch a hot door with your bare hand, count rooms, listen for sound, find the way out before going deeper in. The 3rd floor was like a hallway half swallowed by fire. The door to apartment 3B was cracked open, smoke pushing out in waves. Marcus pressed the back of his hand against the door. It was hot, but not blistering. He pushed it open with his shoulder and stayed close to the floor. Inside, the smoke alarm gave a weak, dying buzz. Furniture had fallen everywhere. A small chair lay tipped over near the dining table. He called out several times, not using a name because he didn't know anyone's name. The child answered with a choking cough. Marcus crawled through the living room, sweeping his hand in front of him. A piece of ceiling near the kitchen fell behind him, and flames crawled up the curtains. A bathroom on the left, a small bedroom on the right, one more room at the end of the hall with the door closed. The coughing came from the small bedroom. The door was stuck because the frame had already warped. Marcus kicked it hard twice before it opened. The smoke in the room was lower, thicker. He called out again. This time he heard fingernails scraping softly beneath the bed. The girl was curled up under it, wearing pale yellow pajamas, her 2 braids half undone, her face smeared with smoke. She was only 5, her eyes wide open but not understanding how to crawl out. Marcus lay flat against the floor and reached toward her. He kept his voice as low and slow as he could, telling her to look at him, not at the fire. Small things like that keep children from breaking apart. When Marcus pulled her out from under the bed, she coughed so hard her whole body folded in. He covered her head and shoulders with the wet part of the jacket and held her tight against his chest. In that moment, he didn't know whose daughter she was. He didn't know her mother ran a billion-dollar corporation. To him, she was just a child struggling to breathe in a room full of smoke, and that was enough. The way out was longer than the way in. The fire had eaten into the ceiling outside the bedroom door. The hallway groaned like something large was moving above them. Marcus carried the girl with his left arm and used his right arm to shield her head. He stayed low, moving in short stretches, but the terrified child clung to his neck and made it hard for him to balance. When they got close to the apartment door, the ceiling above the kitchen collapsed. A section of hot material and burning wiring fell at an angle toward the girl. Marcus turned by reflex and raised his right arm to block it. Heat hit his skin like a living animal. Fire caught on his sleeve. Hot plastic stuck through the fabric. He didn't scream right away. The pain was too big, swallowing the sound for one beat. The girl was covered beneath his chest. Marcus slammed arm against the wall to put out the flames, then carried her down the stairs. The skin from his wrist almost to his elbow burned, but he couldn't let go. Every step made him think he was going to fall. Smoke followed them down to the second floor, then the first. When Marcus finally broke through the door and got outside, the cold air hit his face so hard he nearly dropped to his knees. The fire trucks and ambulance had just arrived. Red and blue lights spun across the street. Someone shouted. Someone pulled the girl from his arms. Marcus set her onto a stretcher before his knees touched the ground. A paramedic asked his name, or maybe just asked if he could hear him, but the sound was mixed into the water, the radios and people calling to each other. His right arm hurt so badly he couldn't lift it. Burned fabric was stuck to the skin. He watched the girl get an oxygen mask, saw her chest rising weakly but still rising. He should have gotten into the ambulance. He knew that. Training had made it clear. Deep burns needed immediate care, smoke inhalation needed monitoring, and a rescuer could also be a victim. But in Marcus's pocket was a $46 envelope, and in his head was the rent still short. An ER bill could turn his rented room into the next thing he lost. No one held his uninjured arm. No one knew his name long enough to call him back. He stepped back into the crowd. Then he left, not because he was a coward. He left because he was poor in the kind of way that doesn't let a person be injured in public. He walked 11 blocks to a late-night community clinic, his right arm held tight against his stomach, cold sweat running down his back. Every time the wind touched the burn, he had to stop and lean against a wall. A nurse there cut the fabric away from his skin, wrapped it temporarily, gave him pain medicine, and handed him a referral to a hospital. Marcus took the paper and nodded, but he didn't go to the hospital that night. By the time the press flooded the scene, the man who had saved the girl was gone. The news called him an unknown man. The Kincaid family posted a reward to find him. Victoria Kincaid had been in Washington for an investment meeting that night. Her husband, Raymond, died in the fire after going back in to help another tenant escape. The man who carried their daughter out had left no name behind. Marcus saw the news in the waiting room at a follow-up clinic a week later. On the screen was the image of the little girl being lifted from the ambulance, her small face under an oxygen mask. He stared for a long time, then lowered his head and hid his bandaged arm in his lap. When the anchor said the family was searching for their daughter's rescuer, Marcus looked away from the screen. He didn't see himself as a rescuer. He saw the bill he hadn't paid, the arm he couldn't straighten, and the fear that if he stepped into the light, people would ask why he had left the scene. That question would always bring another question with it. Why didn't he go to the hospital? Why didn't he give his name? Why would someone who called himself a volunteer firefighter disappear, like someone who had done something wrong? And the real answer was too humiliating in a society that likes its heroes clean. Because he was too poor to stay and be a hero the right way. The burn didn't heal well. The skin tightened, hurt in the cold, went numb in some places, then stabbed like needles when he tried to grip hard. 3 weeks later, during a function test, he failed the grip and mobility standards needed to continue his certification path. The professional board wrote the reason in dry language. Right-hand function did not meet safety standards for firefighting conditions. Marcus had no lawyer to appeal, no money for proper physical therapy, no time off work to fight the file. He signed for the decision the way someone signs for a package delivered to the wrong address, but can't send it back. Later, Marcus would ask himself many times whether the story would have gone differently if he'd had more money, more paperwork, more people standing beside him. But that question didn't pay rent, didn't make his arm hurt less, and didn't bring the certification back. It only stayed inside him, like smoke left behind in an old jacket, and every morning he still woke up before the sun. Losing the certification wasn't only losing a job he hadn't gotten yet. It was losing the identity he had tried to build. The people at District 9 called a few times, then less and less, not because they were cruel. Poverty has a way of making people so tired they don't have the strength to save each other. Marcus moved into night security, then loading work, then cleaning office buildings. His right arm was always covered with long sleeves, even in summer. Sometimes people didn't ask further, and that was easier. 2 years later, Zoe was born. Her mother stayed with Marcus for a while, then left when Zoe had just turned 1. There was no dramatic goodbye. Just small arguments thinning into silence, and then one morning, the closet had fewer clothes in it. She couldn't live with money always being short, with Marcus's hand hurting in cold weather, with the way he still woke up when he smelled smoke from neighbors grilling outside. Poverty doesn't only take money, it takes the patience from people who once loved each other. He learned to raise Zoe through overlapping work schedules. Night security so he could take her to appointments during the day. Early morning cleaning so he could pick her up after school. Cheaper ointment than the doctor recommended. Apples cut into slices because Zoe ate more when the pieces were small. Bills taped to the refrigerator so he wouldn't forget them, even though seeing them every morning made his heart feel like there was a stone in his chest. In the present, before every shift at Kincaid Group, Marcus still pulled his sleeve low. The night before Derek tore it, Zoe had rubbed cream onto the scar, with her index finger slow and careful. She asked again if it hurt. Marcus said it only tickled a little. Zoe didn't believe him, but she smiled because she wanted him to smile too. After she fell asleep, Marcus stood at her bedroom door for a long time. He thought about what would happen if someone recognized the scar one day. He would have to explain why he hadn't stayed at the scene, why he hadn't gone to the hospital, why he let a wealthy family search for someone while he himself hid from the light. And then he would have to say the oldest truth of his life. Back then, he didn't have enough money to be hurt properly. The memory stopped at the sound of tearing fabric. The Kincaid Group lobby came back around him in white marble cold lights and the smell of expensive perfume. Marcus stood in front of Derek Holt, his right arm exposed, blood seeping at the scar's edge because the fabric had been pulled too hard. He didn't look at the people gathering around. He only looked down at the skin the fire had bitten, the skin he had hidden for 10 years like a failure too hard to explain. Behind the sofa, Amara Kincaid opened her notebook with shaking fingers. The last page showed the half-moon shape she had drawn that morning in the corner of the paper, right beside an unfinished class note. She held the notebook up at eye level, then looked again at Marcus's arm. That curve, that position, that break at one end, like skin once torn by something pulling through it. It didn't look like an imaginary symbol anymore. It was an address for memory. In Amara's mind, the broken pieces of that North Philly night stopped floating loose. Smoke under the bed, an arm reaching into the dark, the smell of wet fabric, a man's voice telling her to hold on to her stuffed animal and stay low, the feeling of being pressed tight against a stranger's chest, but safe. Then ambulance lights, then that person was gone. She looked up at Marcus's face for the first time, not as a man cleaning the floor, but as the man who had stood between her and the fire before she was old enough to know how to say thank you. Marcus still didn't understand the way she was looking at him. Derek was still saying something about procedure and professional environment. Victoria still hadn't fully stepped out of her call. But Amara knew. She knew now. She just hadn't said it yet. Inside the glass lobby of Kincaid Group, Victoria Kincaid's sentence fell like a stamp pressed onto someone else's life. She was still holding her phone, her eyes on the incident report Derek Holt had just handed over. Terminate the contract immediately. HR would handle it before the end of the day. Just one process triggered by a few lines on paper and a pair of eyes that had never stopped long enough on the person being fired. Marcus Webb stood less than 10 feet away from her, his right sleeve torn open, the small line of blood already drying into a dark mark across the scarred skin. He listened to Derek explain surface safety, attitude, and uniform standards. The words passed through Marcus's head like the sound of air conditioning. He didn't argue each point because he had learned a long time ago that the more a man in his position explained, the more he sounded like he was begging to be spared. He only pulled the fabric lower, even though it didn't cover much. An HR employee was called down to the lobby 10 minutes later. She was young, her hair pinned neatly, a tablet held against her chest, her face arranged into the trained neutrality of the job. Marcus recognized that kind of neutrality. It wasn't cruel, but it helped cruelty become a form. She confirmed his name, employee ID, and start date, then asked him to sign the suspension notice leading to termination. All of it happened beside the floor scrubber still plugged into the wall. This was the third job Marcus had lost in 2 years. A night security contract had ended when the company changed vendors. A loading shift had been cut because his right hand tightened up in cold weather. And now Kincaid Group, where the pay wasn't high but it was steady, enough to buy milk every Friday, pay the electric bill, and keep Zoe in her after-school program for one more month. After this, he didn't know where the money for next month's childcare would come from. He thought about the tuition reminder taped to the refrigerator, about the $23 in his wallet, about Zoe's purple lunchbox sitting in her school bag. But he didn't beg. Poverty made people ask for extension, ask for a little more time, ask them not to cut the lights before the weekend. This white marble lobby wasn't where he wanted to get on his knees with words. He signed with his left hand because his right hand hurt. He thought that if he collapsed right here, the building outside would still glow, the glass doors would still open, and someone else would clean the wet strip of the floor. Then he asked to collect his personal things from the employee locker. His lunchbox, a thin jacket, and the photo of Zoe taped inside the locker door. Derek looked at his watch, then granted him 5 minutes. Marcus nodded. He didn't look at Victoria. If he looked, he was afraid he would see that she was just like everyone else. A rich woman believing a report before believing her own eyes. Amara Kincaid still stood beside the sofa. Her notebook was pressed tightly to her chest, the page with the half-moon drawing not completely closed. She watched Marcus sign the paper. She watched her mother nod to HR. She watched Derek stand there like a man who had protected the building from a stain. Her throat was so dry she couldn't call out right away. She was only 15, but she understood enough to know that when her mother entered CEO mode, everything was put into decision boxes: right, wrong, risk, responsibility. If Amara shouted in the middle of the lobby that this janitor might be the man who had saved her, her mother would look at her like a panic episode that needed to be removed from the scene. So Amara didn't talk about the scar. She followed her mother into the executive elevator, her hands holding the notebook like evidence. Victoria was still speaking with her assistant about the internal memo and the 9 o'clock meeting. Her face wasn't cold because she had no feelings. It was cold because she had learned that feelings could make everything collapse. 10 years earlier, after the fire, Victoria had learned to survive by schedules and decisions. Without them, the grief of losing Raymond and the terror of almost losing her daughter would have swallowed her whole. On the 38th floor, Amara stood in front of her mother's desk. She looked at the glass cabinet in the corner the way she always had since she was little. Inside it sat the burned safety helmet, part of the rim melted, displayed on a low stand. Her mother had kept it for 10 years. No one in their house talked about it much. It was what remained from the night an unnamed man carried Amara out of the fire before her father never came home. Amara asked if she could see the morning maintenance report. Victoria was electronically signing an urgent document and only answered, "Not right now." Amara took another step forward, trying to keep her voice steady, and asked if that report included lobby camera footage. Victoria looked up for a moment and saw her daughter's face had gone pale. But then the phone rang again. A legal advisor was waiting. She told Amara to sit down and let the adults handle the staffing issue. The words weren't cruel, but they made Amara feel 5 years old again in the smoke, being told to wait for someone to come. She didn't sit. She stood beside the glass wall looking down over the city, and for the first time in years the memory had a shape clearer than a nightmare. A half-moon scar, a burned sleeve, a man's voice telling her to hold tight. That person wasn't a legend. That person had just been pushed out of the building by her mother. Down on the ground floor, Linda Torres hid in the administrative storage room after watching Marcus walk toward the employee area. She closed the door, placed the documents on the table, then sat down on the plastic chair beside the printer paper boxes. Her heart was pounding because of something no camera could see, the cowardly feeling of knowing she had just stayed silent in front of something wrong. She had watched Derek push Marcus around for 8 months. She had seen him make Marcus reclean entire hallways over one wheel mark, change schedules so Marcus stayed late without logging overtime, call him by his last name with a cold edge while calling other managers by their first names. Linda opened her phone. The lock screen was a photo of her 2 grown children, one in a community college graduation gown, the other in a nurse's uniform. She looked at that photo for a long time as if asking them to forgive her. She knew that if she spoke up, Derek could make her job harder to breathe through. She had 2 more years before she had enough savings to retire. She had blood pressure medication, rent, and a son who still needed help sometimes. None of those reasons was false, but together they still made a silence. Marcus opened his employee locker in the changing room behind the service area. It was narrow, painted gray, one top corner of the door slightly bent. Inside were his lunchbox, a light jacket, a small tube of ointment, and a photo of Zoe taped up with clear tape. In the picture, Zoe was missing one front tooth, holding a paper sign for her first day of first grade. Her eyes almost closed from smiling. Marcus peeled the photo down carefully so the tape wouldn't tear the paper. He placed it in his wallet beside the 3 bills he had left. His lunchbox felt unexpectedly heavy in his hand, cold rice, a boiled egg, and the badly cut apple pieces. A poor man's lunch, but Marcus still put it into his bag as if he were packing away the rest of the day. He changed out of the torn janitor's shirt and into his own jacket, pulling the sleeve down over the scar. The bleeding had stopped, but the skin burned with every movement where it had been yanked. Derek waited outside the service hallway, radio in hand, as if he was afraid Marcus might steal the building in his last 5 minutes. He didn't look at the lunchbox or the photo, only at the clock. Marcus passed him without speaking. The way he didn't answer bothered Derek more than an insult would have. Some people only feel powerful when someone else reacts. The way out through the back gate forced Marcus past the hallway that connected to the executive elevator area. Cleaners usually didn't use that route during peak hours, but Derek wanted him gone as quickly as possible, so he pointed toward the side door near the CEO's ground floor office. Marcus pushed the small cart with his jacket and personal bag, walking slowly past the frosted glass. Then he saw the helmet. Victoria's ground floor office was used only when she met major clients right after they entered the lobby. The glass door was clear, the curtain half open. In the corner of the room, a tall display case held a burned safety helmet. The right side of the rim had melted, the edge curling into a rough black strip. Marcus stopped longer than a man who had just been fired should stop. His breath caught halfway up his throat. He remembered that helmet, not because it had fully belonged to him. That night, someone in the apartment building had thrown him an old safety helmet from the downstairs maintenance area before he ran in, something almost useless against a major fire, but still enough to shield him from falling debris. The right rim melted when he used his arm to cover the little girl as the ceiling came down. He had dropped it when he handed the child to the paramedics. He thought it had been thrown away with the wreckage, but there it was inside a glass case owned by the woman who had just signed the order to fire him. Marcus stood still, his eyes fixed on the melted plastic. In that moment, 10 years collapsed into one small object. Smoke, sirens, a burned arm, a little girl breathing through an oxygen mask, then the long life afterward of hiding his sleeve and cleaning floors. If you were Marcus, and you knew the woman who had just fired you was keeping the helmet from that night in a glass case, would you speak up or keep silent? Would you reclaim your name or keep that old poverty from being exposed all over again? Sometimes the hardest thing isn't proving you once did something good. It's accepting that someone else might see the price you paid for it. Marcus pulled his eyes away from the display case. He kept pushing the cart. Maybe it should all end the way it had started. No one asked his name, and he didn't trouble the world with the answer. Up on the 38th floor, Amara didn't wait for her mother anymore. When Victoria took the second call, she picked up her notebook and backed out of the office. An assistant tried to stop her, but Amara had known the executive hallway since she was little. She moved quickly to the elevator, pressed the ground floor button, her heart beating with each number dropping on the display. She didn't have a complete plan. She only knew that if she let that man walk through the gate, 10 years of searching would close again because of an HR report. The elevator doors opened just as Marcus was getting close to the back gate. He was walking alone, his personal bag over one shoulder, his lunchbox in his left hand. The floor scrubber had been left in the supply room, but Derek had forced him out before he could finish the last section of the floor. Amara stepped out and couldn't call to him at first. Her voice caught the way it had that night under the bed. She said one very small word, wait. Marcus heard it, but he didn't turn around. Maybe he thought she was calling someone else. Maybe he knew she was calling him, but was too tired for more questions. Amara walked faster, her school shoes tapping against the stone floor. This time she called out more clearly, more politely, almost begging. Please wait. Marcus stopped a few steps from the back gate. He turned slowly, with the careful look of a man who had learned that every voice calling from behind him in a luxury building usually led to another problem. Amara stood in front of him, breathing hard, her notebook open in both hands. The page faced him. In the corner of the page was the half-moon shape, drawn over and over in black pen. Marcus looked at it, then looked down at his right arm beneath the sleeve he had pulled low. He didn't say anything, but for one brief moment the distance in his face fell away. Amara said she had been drawing this shape for 10 years, not once, not after reading the news. In every notebook, in the margins of tests behind book covers, in places where she didn't know why her hand kept going back to that curve. She looked straight at Marcus for the first time, not like she was looking at a janitor, and not like she was looking at a man who had just been fired. She looked at him like someone standing before a door in her memory that had finally opened. Marcus looked into her eyes. Those eyes were older now, and the face had lost the roundness of the 5-year-old girl, but the fear and recognition inside them pulled him back to the smoke-filled room. He saw the child under the bed clutching a stuffed animal. He saw the small hand gripping his wet jacket. He saw the oxygen mask being placed over that tiny face under the ambulance lights, and Marcus understood. The child he had once carried out of the fire was standing in front of him now, 15 years old, inside the building where he had just been treated like an error that needed to be erased from a file. Amara knew it. Marcus knew it too. But between them stood an entire building that still refused to see. Amara Kincaid stood in the hallway behind the lobby, both hands gripping the notebook as if she were holding a piece of memory pulled out of smoke. Marcus Webb stood in front of her, his personal bag hanging from one shoulder, his lunchbox in his left hand, his right arm hidden beneath the torn sleeve. The back gate was only a few steps away. If he walked through it, the building would swallow everything back down. The termination report, Derek's words about procedure, the blood on scarred skin, and the 15-year-old girl who had just recognized the man who saved her. Amara didn't let him leave. She stepped closer, not forcefully, but with enough determination that Marcus had to fully stop. She asked permission with her eyes before touching his sleeve, though her hands still shook. Marcus could step back, but her eyes weren't like the eyes of people who only wanted to confirm a mistake. They looked like the eyes of a child trying to find a way out of a dark room. He loosened his arm. Amara lifted the torn sleeve. The half-moon scar appeared under the hallway lights, rough and silent. She placed the notebook beside his arm. On the page was the half moon drawn over and over in black pen, the same curve, the same break at the upper edge, the same position if you imagined it between the wrist and elbow. No one needed to say much. The resemblance stood there by itself. Amara looked at the page, then at his skin. She murmured that this was it, the shape, the place, everything. The sentence was very small, but it made something old move inside Marcus's chest. He didn't answer. For 10 years he had told himself this scar was a private consequence, something to hide under long sleeves and cheap ointment. Now it was lying beside the notebook page of the girl he had carried out of the fire, and for the first time, it looked like proof that that night hadn't been only his own dream. Amara looked up. She said he had been there, North Philly 10 years ago. It wasn't a question. She said it like she was setting a stone in its proper place. Marcus looked toward the back gate. The old habit inside him told him to leave. He told her she should go find her mother. That answer didn't deny it, and it didn't confirm it either. It only opened a way for her to escape having to stand beside the man who had just been fired. But Amara didn't leave. She said her mother had searched for that man for 10 years. Her voice broke at the end because even she understood the cruelty of this moment. Her wealthy mother had kept the burned helmet in a glass case, while the man carrying the real burn had been pushed out of the lobby like a hygiene problem. Inside the lobby, Derek Holt finally realized something was happening beyond the reach of his report. He walked toward them, the radio on his shoulder crackling softly. He hadn't heard everything Amara said, but he saw the CEO's daughter holding the arm of a janitor whose contract had just been terminated. To Derek, everything immediately became an image risk, a former employee approaching a leader's family member. He turned his contempt into responsibility. Marcus pulled his sleeve down, but Amara lightly held his wrist. She wasn't only protecting a memory anymore. She was protecting the person inside that memory from being erased a second time. The executive elevator opened at the far end of the lobby. Victoria Kincaid stepped out faster than usual. An assistant followed behind, tense because Amara had left the office without warning. Victoria was about to call her daughter's name in a firm voice, but the first sentence died on her lips when she saw Amara standing beside Marcus, her hand still near the scar. The whole lobby slowed down. Victoria didn't recognize him right away. It came up in pieces, through the old smell of smoke, through the hospital night, through the reward calls, through the bed where her 5-year-old daughter had kept asking where the man who carried her out had gone. Victoria stepped closer. Her heels struck the white marble, each step shorter than the last. Amara didn't give a long explanation. She only told her mother to look at his arm. Marcus stood still. He could endure many kinds of looks, quick looks, contemptuous looks, looks that inspected a uniform. But the way Victoria looked when her eyes stopped on the scar made him unsure where to put his body. It wasn't gratitude at first, it was pain first. Pain from recognizing a shape that had lived inside her daughter's nightmares. Pain because the helmet in the glass case wasn't only a keepsake, but a question she had just almost let slip through her hands inside her own building. Derek cut in with a procedural voice. He reminded Victoria that this employee had violated policy, refused inspection, and created an inappropriate scene. He used the words former employee before HR had even completed the paperwork, as if calling Marcus a thing of the past could push him out of the present. Victoria didn't answer him. She looked at Marcus, then at Amara, then at the notebook. Amara opened the page wider and placed it beside his arm again. The first truth had appeared through the smallest objects. A drawing made by the child who had been saved and a scar carried by the man who saved her. But a drawing could still be called a false memory by adults. A scar could still be called coincidence. Marcus knew that, so he didn't speak. His silence was like a man standing before a door, not yet believing the other side was truly open. Linda Torres stepped out from the hallway behind the reception desk. At first, she had only meant to watch the way she always had. But when she saw Victoria looking at the scar and saw Derek preparing to wrap the truth inside another report, Linda pressed a hand to her chest, took a very difficult breath, and stepped forward. Part of the lobby turned toward her. Linda wasn't powerful, but she had 8 months of seeing Marcus every morning. She told Victoria she had seen him cover that arm every day, that he had never shown it off, never told the story, never used it to ask for kinder treatment, that Derek had pushed him around many times and Marcus had still arrived on time, still finished his work, still nodded hello to the only person willing to look at him. The more Linda spoke, the more her voice shook, not because she was performing emotion, because every sentence pulled a piece of old silence out of her. She didn't decorate Marcus into a saint. She only said what the building hadn't written into any report, that this man had suffered in silence, and that silence had been used against him. Derek snapped his head toward Linda. There was a warning in his eyes, but this time, Linda didn't lower her face. She looked at him long enough to admit she had once been afraid, then turned back to Victoria. That small act didn't erase 8 months of silence, but it was the first step. Victoria listened to all of it. Her face changed in a way no one but Amara would recognize. The cold CEO layer was still there, but beneath it, the mother who had once sat outside an emergency room 10 years earlier began to rise. She remembered her little girl drawing meaningless curves, and she remembered letting the doctors call it a trauma processing mechanism because she herself had been too hurt to look closer. Amara suddenly turned and ran into her mother's ground floor office. An assistant moved to stop her, but Victoria raised a hand. The entire lobby waited in silence. Marcus watched the direction where the girl disappeared, then looked down at his arm. But that night was coming back, not through fire, but through objects he couldn't deny. Amara came back carrying the burned safety helmet in both hands. She walked more slowly while holding it, as if she were carrying something both sacred and fragile. The helmet had sat inside a glass case for 10 years, dusted, preserved, looked at with gratitude for a nameless man. When it left the case, the air in the lobby seemed to change. That object made the story stop existing only inside memory. Amara placed the helmet into Marcus's hands. At first he didn't take it. Both his hands shifted back a little, as if touching it would make the fire pain wake up again. But Amara kept holding it up. Finally, Marcus reached out with his left hand and took it. The helmet was heavier than he remembered. The melted rim sat on the right side, exactly where that night he had raised his arm to shield the girl. The melted edge had a black streak running along it, matching the direction of the scar on his skin. The helmet was his size. Marcus looked down at the helmet, and Kincaid Group's lobby saw for the first time that the janitor they had walked past for months wasn't some touching story that had suddenly appeared. He had already been that man long before they knew, long before Derek tore the sleeve, long before Victoria stepped out of the elevator, long before the glass case, the reward, or the thank you. Greatness had existed in a burning hallway in North Philly, when a poor man hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, and then ran in because no one else was there. Victoria reached out and lightly touched the rim of the helmet, but stopped before touching Marcus. She was standing very close to the man who had saved her daughter, and for the first time her wealth became useless in a way that felt shameful. Money had kept the helmet inside the glass. Money had built this building, but money hadn't helped her recognize the scar right under the sleeve of the man cleaning her floor. Derek broke the moment with a rigid sentence. He said this didn't change the incident report. Policy was still policy. If they made an exception, the building would open itself to a dangerous precedent. Even then, he still believed he was standing on the side of order. The whole lobby had seen the truth, and he still saw an administrative problem. Victoria turned to him. She said his name once. Derek kept going, softer but still stubborn. He said if the company allowed a motion to override standards, legal would have to handle the risk. Victoria said his name again. Her voice was colder now, not loud, but it cut through the lobby like the edge of glass. This time Derek shut his mouth. She only told him to go upstairs. Derek's humiliation lay in being removed from the moment he thought he controlled. He walked toward the elevator. As the doors were nearly closed, he leaned toward an assistant and said they needed to call legal, that this would become a liability. No apology. No look at Marcus. No look at Amara. He only translated the truth into liability because that was the last language left to a man who didn't know remorse. Upstairs, meetings would continue. Emails would be sent. Lawyers would try to turn pain into clauses. But right there in the lobby, no one could pretend Marcus was just the man who cleaned the floor anymore. His arm, Amara's notebook, and the burned helmet stood beside one another like 3 silent witnesses, real enough to make every excuse feel small. What hurt Victoria most wasn't only that she hadn't found him for 10 years. It was that this morning she had stood just a few steps from him and still almost let him be pushed away forever. Victoria stood in the middle of the lobby in front of employees gathering from reception, the elevators, and the administrative hall. She couldn't undo 10 years. She couldn't give Marcus back his uninjured arm, the certification that had been taken from him, or the night Zoe rubbed ointment onto the scar without knowing her father had once been called the unknown man. But she could stop the wrong happening in front of her. The termination order was canceled right there in the lobby. Victoria told HR to withdraw the report, seal the morning's camera footage, and open an independent investigation into how Derek had treated employees over the past 8 months. She spoke in her CEO voice, but her eyes stayed on Marcus. Then that voice softened slightly when she said she owed him more than a job. Marcus was still holding the helmet. He answered that she didn't owe him anything. He had truly lived 10 years with that thought. He had saved a child because the child needed saving. He didn't send anyone's conscience an invoice. Victoria looked at Amara. Her daughter stood beside Marcus, eyes red but not crying. Victoria said her daughter was alive because of him. That sentence changed the air. It wasn't a statement, wasn't a report, wasn't PR. It was a mother finally giving the right name to her debt. Marcus lowered his head slightly. He said he knew. Those 2 words didn't brag and they didn't complain. They only acknowledged a truth that had lived in his bones for 10 years. He knew the girl had lived. That was why he had been able to endure so much afterward. Victoria asked if she could meet with him after work or whenever he felt able so they could speak properly. Marcus nodded, but his eyes slid toward the corner of the lobby near the revolving door. His floor scrubber was still there, the tank half full, the marble near the entrance still marked with damp streaks and shoe prints from the morning chaos. No one asked him to go back to work. The termination had just been canceled, but technically his shift had been interrupted. Marcus still walked toward the scrubber. He placed the safety helmet on the sofa near Amara, picked up a dry towel, and plugged the machine back in. His right arm hurt, so he steered more with his left, moving slowly, cleaning the unfinished section of floor. The whole lobby watched. It wasn't submission. It wasn't that he didn't understand the weight of the moment. Marcus simply remembered that he had started something and hadn't finished it. Years earlier, he had heard a child's voice and stayed. That morning, after every insult, he still saw a wet streak on the floor and chose to clean it so someone else wouldn't slip. The way people finish the smallest things can say more than any speech. Amara stood beside the helmet, one hand on her notebook. Victoria stood a few steps from Marcus, truly seeing for the first time the man whose back was turned toward the light. And as the floor scrubber moved across the white marble, the building went so quiet that the sound of its small wheels felt like an oath. That evening, Marcus Webb got back to Kensington when the streetlights had turned a tired yellow. He didn't go straight inside. He stood at the bottom of the iron stairs of the old brick building, one hand on the railing, the other holding his personal bag. Inside the bag were his uneaten lunchbox, Zoe's photo tucked deep in his wallet, and the smell of Kincaid's glass lobby still clinging to his jacket like something that didn't belong there. His whole day had been bent out of shape too fast. That morning, he had only been a floor cleaner whose sleeve got torn. By noon, he was holding the burned helmet he thought had disappeared forever. By late afternoon, Victoria Kincaid had stood in front of him, canceled the termination order, demanded an investigation into Derek Holt, and asked to meet with him again so they could talk properly. But when Marcus opened the door to his small apartment, the first thing he heard wasn't applause or thank you. It was the sound of Zoe's pencil scratching over homework paper. The girl was sitting at the kitchen table, her feet swinging from the chair, her curls tied crookedly to one side. On the table were her math workbook, a box of colored pencils, and the cheap jar of ointment Marcus kept near the sink. Zoe looked up, saw her father's face, then looked straight down at his right sleeve. Children sometimes recognize pain before adults managed to hide it. Marcus took off his jacket. For the first time in many years, he didn't immediately pull his sleeve down. The half-moon scar appeared beneath the small kitchen light, the edge of the skin still red from where Derek had torn it open that morning. Zoe jumped off the chair, ran to get a damp paper towel, then pulled her father into a seat like the little doctor of the house. She didn't ask who had hurt him. She only opened the ointment, touched a little to the tip of her finger, and rubbed it over the old skin slowly, carefully, the way she did every night. Marcus watched that small hand move over the scar that had taken from him a career, an identity, and years of peace. Before, whenever Zoe put ointment on it, he usually pulled the sleeve back down right after, as if covering it quickly could give the story less chance to escape. But tonight, he left it uncovered. Zoe looked up and asked if it hurt more today. Marcus looked at his daughter for a long time and said yes, but not in a bad way. It was the truest thing he could say inside that small kitchen with the bills still taped to the refrigerator. Somewhere else in the city, Victoria Kincaid didn't sleep either. Her home office stayed lit until nearly midnight. On the desk were the files from the North Philly fire 10 years earlier, copies of the incident report, old news articles, and the list of calls her family had once made to find the man who saved Amara. For years, she had thought she simply hadn't searched hard enough. Tonight, she understood the cruelty was deeper than that. The man had never had the conditions to be found in the way wealthy people think is normal. The incident report had no name for the witness who carried the child out, only one short line stating that a female minor victim had been handed over to medical personnel before the fire unit accessed the third floor. No statement, no identity, no signature. Victoria read that line over and over. It was cold enough to feel insulting. A whole person's life could be pressed into a blank space on a report. She called District 9. After several transfers, an older officer remembered Marcus Webb's old training file. He confirmed that a young volunteer had been present at the fire before the main unit arrived, then lost the ability to complete certification because of burns to his right hand and grip function failure. The suspension was recorded 3 weeks after the fire. No appeal, no lawyer listed, no one standing beside him when the file closed. Victoria set the phone down. She looked at Raymond's photograph on the bookshelf. Her husband had died that night after going back in to help another tenant escape. That pain had made her afraid to touch the rest of the story. She had kept the safety helmet like a shrine to a memory, while outside the real man with the burn had been cleaning floors inside her own building. The late gratitude made her feel more ashamed than the ignorance. The next day, Victoria drove herself to Kensington. No driver, no entourage, no cameras. Her Blackson parked under the old brick row building, too polished among dented pickup trucks and graffiti-marked trash bins. She sat in the car for a few minutes before stepping out. For the first time in years, Victoria didn't know what role to use to begin a meeting. CEO sounded too cold. Mother sounded too late. Debtor sounded too small beside what Marcus had done. Zoe opened the door. The girl looked up at Victoria, then down at the expense suit, then back at her face with the seriousness only a 7-year-old can have. Marcus stepped out from the kitchen, still wearing a long-sleeved t-shirt, though the right sleeve wasn't pulled all the way down to his wrist like before. Victoria hadn't introduced herself yet when Zoe asked if she was the lady who had fired her dad. Victoria didn't dodge it. She said yes. Zoe thought about that, then asked if she was also the lady who unfired him. Victoria said yes again. The girl considered it for one more second, then stepped aside and let her in. Marcus's apartment was so small that Victoria could see everything at once. The kitchen table used as a homework desk, the old sofa covered with a blanket, the child's shoes near the door, the bill calendar on the refrigerator, the jar of ointment by the sink. Nothing here had been arranged to make her feel something. That ordinary truth was what made it hard for Victoria to breathe. This was where the man who had saved her daughter had lived after the world hadn't stopped long enough to ask his name. Their conversation happened on 2 kitchen chairs. Victoria didn't bring an envelope of cash. She understood money might be necessary, but if she started with money, she would turn Marcus into someone receiving charity, not someone being restored. She placed a folder on the table. Inside was a legal plan to petition the professional board to review Marcus's volunteer firefighting certification based on updated medical records, new functional testing, and evidence from the fire that had been missing from the original file. Kincaid Group would cover all legal fees, physical therapy, and anything else needed to give Marcus the fair chance he hadn't been able to buy 10 years ago. Marcus read slowly. Zoe stood beside him with one hand on his shoulder. Victoria also talked about a new training fund for volunteer firefighters in North Philly. It would be called the Raymond Kincaid Volunteer Fire Training Fund. Not to polish the Kincaid Group name, but so people like Marcus wouldn't have to run into fire with a wet jacket, no insurance, no lawyer, and no one writing down their name. The fund would pay for equipment, basic insurance, certification tuition, and legal support for volunteers injured on duty. Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at Raymond's name on the page, then at Victoria. Between them were 2 different kinds of loss born from the same burning night. She had lost a husband. He had lost a future. Amara had lived. Zoe had been born afterward into a tight, difficult life Victoria had never known. No one in that kitchen could turn the story into perfect justice. But for the first time, justice wasn't only an apology. It had an address, a budget, a process, and the names of people whose lives had been partly taken by the fire. 6 months later, the Volunteer Training Center in North Philly opened on a clear morning. The building wasn't large, just 2 stories, new red brick, a practice yard in the back with a climbing tower, a smoke simulation room, and an equipment storage room filled with helmets, turnout gear, and air tanks. On the bronze plaque by the entrance was the name Raymond Kincaid Volunteer Fire Training Fund, and beneath it, in smaller letters, a line honoring those who stayed when others needed them most. Marcus stood near the gate in a new volunteer uniform, not the blue janitor's shirt, not a rented suit for an award ceremony. It was the uniform he had once thought he would wear for the rest of his life before the fire changed his right arm. The fabric was still stiff, the shoulders a little wide, but when Zoe looked at her father, she stood straighter, as if she had grown a few inches herself. Amara stood beside them, holding up her notebook for a photo. The page with the half-moon shape was clipped open, no longer like a nightmare, but like a map that had led her back to the right person. Victoria stood 3 steps away from them. She didn't stand pressed beside Marcus like his rescuer. She didn't put a hand on his shoulder for the cameras. She didn't try to turn gratitude into ownership. She stood in the place of someone who had finally learned how to thank the right person, the right way, with the right distance. When a reporter asked Marcus how he felt, he didn't talk much about himself. He looked toward the practice yard, where young volunteers were testing the new equipment, and said if one more person didn't have to run and found a fire alone, that was enough. Zoe held her father's hand. Amara stood on the other side, her notebook against her chest. Victoria looked at the 3 of them and understood that some debts could never be fully repaid, but they could be turned into a door held open for somebody else. If I had to keep one thing from this story, I wouldn't keep the moment the glass lobby went silent, and I wouldn't keep the scene of a billionaire woman stepping into a small apartment in Kensington. I would keep the image of Marcus sitting in his kitchen, letting his 7-year-old daughter rub ointment onto a scar he had hidden for years. Because sometimes greatness doesn't stand under spotlights. It sits quietly on an old chair, letting a small child touch the most painful part of it without pulling the sleeve down anymore. Marcus didn't become worthy of respect on the day Victoria recognized him. He had been worthy since that night in North Philly, when a tired poor man with no health insurance hesitated for exactly 3 seconds and still ran into the fire because he hurt a child. What society did afterward is the shameful part. It gave him a scar, took his certification, let him become an invisible man cleaning floors, and only began to listen when a billionaire's daughter recognized the half-moon on his arm. There are so many Marcuses in real life. People who open doors so others can run out, then never say their own names. People who stay 5 extra minutes after a shift to make sure no one slips. People People who raise children on cheap lunches pull sleeves over wounds and don't turn their pain into a reason to stop being kind. They don't need our pity. They need us to see them. The most beautiful thing Victoria did wasn't canceling the termination. That was only correcting the wrong that had just happened. The more beautiful thing was that she turned gratitude into a structure useful to other people. A training fund, insurance, equipment, a chance to restore certification, and a name placed on a door so future volunteers wouldn't have to disappear if they were hurt. Real gratitude doesn't just say thank you. It changes the way a system treats the people it once forgot. And Amara, the girl who had been saved from beneath a smoke-filled bed, did what the adults hadn't managed to do in 10 years. She trusted her memory. A half moon in a notebook might look small, but sometimes it's the small details that keep the truth from dying completely. If that girl hadn't stood up, Marcus could walked out the back gate with his uneaten lunchbox, once again becoming the unnamed man in his own story. So the question left behind isn't whether we recognize heroes when they're wearing beautiful uniforms. The question is whether we recognize them when they're holding a mop, delivering packages in the rain, standing behind a counter, working the night shift, or bending down to do the work no one wants to look at. Who once stayed for you, and you never even knew their name? If someone like that exists in your life, even as a faded memory, tell the story. Not to turn them into a legend, but to remind each other that quiet kindness deserves to be named too. Being named at the right time doesn't always change the past, but it can help someone exhausted believe they didn't live for nothing. Maybe what stays after this story isn't the scar on Marcus's arm, but the question: has someone ever quietly stayed for you, helped you through a dark day, then disappeared before you learned their name? If so, tell that story in the comments so the invisible good people can be called by name. And if this story touched you, like and subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in the next story.